CardGamesTV1 Podcast. Something I noticed that I don't do a lot. Well, mainly I don't talk a lot about, decks that I see are, like leaders that I see potential in that, have the potential to be played. Like I see the potential, then I'll, make a folder, put the leader in there, put some cards in there, so I can start working on the deck. But I don't share, the idea that I see the potential in these leaders out there. I wait until obviously I do the deck profiles, which can take a while because I tend to work on a lot of different decks. Especially if they're, concepts and ideas. Not necessarily decks that I'm going to be playing a lot of or, competitively or anything, but they have potential, they have potential just for being a good deck in general. So, the Janemba leader, for example, that still has viability, that still has use. I still expect people to be trying to make that deck faster, better, stronger. And there are some new cards that definitely help that deck, do its thing. So, I'm working on a Janemba deck if that's not obvious. So obviously I see some potential in Janemba because the funny thing is that I tend to focus more on, aggro and burn, for example, and even a little bit of hand control. I barely do control like a counter strategy. So I barely do control, so because I barely play counter plays myself. So the idea of a mill deck, is not on the list of things to play in my mind. Like I'm more focused because of the thing is for me is that my opponent has 8 life. That's not a lot of life. And I've always said the first 4 damage is the easiest, next 2 requires a little effort. So that alone, you can easily deal 6 damage with very little effort. Very little effort. You don't even have to have a lot of experience and play the game as long as I have to be able to do 6 damage. Even 7, right? Because, it depends on your opponent and, how they react to your attacks and the plays you make that determine, how often they'll end up at 2 or 1 life. And then it's just a matter of you, waiting for the right opportunity, creating the opportunity, which is the most important thing. You rather have control. You want to create the opportunity for you to go for game and win. You don't want to wait for the opportunity. Sometimes you have to wait, sometimes you got to wait for the right time, to go for game. You can't just go for game just because, your opponent has 1 life and you have a couple attacks and you could try to go for game, because a lot of times that can end up failing. You can end up not winning that turn, and then that's the turn that caused you to lose out the game, or just made it where your opponent was able to make a comeback. So you always got to be careful. Make sure that you have the perfect storm is what I like to call it. You want to wait for the perfect storm, where everything is going the way you want it to go, the ideal scenario for you to go for game. Don't try to go for game when things are not that favorable. Like, for example, if your opponent's hand size is above 6 cards, that typically is unfavorable. You want their hand size to be less than 6. That's the more ideal scenario. And you want them to be tapped out, and you want them not to have blockers. And you're hoping that they're not playing blue, so they don't have a baby Hatchiac, right, for example. And those types of factors. So there's a lot that you have to take into account when, you're trying to make a decision for, if you're going to go for game or not. And that's all it really is. This game boils down to is going for game, is waiting for the right moment to finish out the game. Some players, they tend to play a little bit slower, I'll say, where they deliberately try to deal at least 4 damage at most, and then just wait for, the right moment, as it were, to try to do the remaining 4 damage all in one turn. Or they might do 2 damage and then try to do all 6 damage late game at a specific, moment where they feel they have the advantage. If it works, it works. I'm not saying that that's not the best way to play or that's wrong. If it works for them, it works for them, right? I just like to make things more simple, and simplify things, especially for new players. I'd rather that they get into the habit of doing a lot of damage as quickly as possible when it's easier for them to do that, which is the first 2 turns of the game. And then after that, play, meticulously, take your time, keep your defenses up and stuff like that. Like, I'd rather do that. It's not too different from like when you're fighting, right? If you're in a fight, you don't want to wait until after a couple of swings from your opponent to start swinging back. You want to start off swinging. They swing at you, block, then swing back. And, y'all keep going back and forth. And hopefully you end up in a scenario where you swinging at them more than they swinging at you, and you end up winning. That's what you want. You don't want to be in a scenario where you're holding back. You're swinging less to the point where, you're swinging less, they're swinging more. And eventually they'll have the upper hand, and they might end up knocking you out if you're not, if you're not careful, if you don't plan. Always plan, how you're going to win, right? Always have that in mind. You need to know when you're going to win, not if you're going to win. It shouldn't be luck or a guessing game when it comes to winning the game. It should be deliberate, planned out, right? You winning the game should be like a combo, right? A strategy. As long as you play all your cards, in the right order, as they say, then the outcome should be what you determine the outcome to be. So, you want to be careful how you set up. You want to be careful about what the plays you make, the moves you make. You want to make sure everything works out the way you want it. Also, always have a backup plan in case things don't work out the way you plan it. And that's life, right? A lot of times it doesn't. That's the point of your opponent, right? The purpose of your opponent is to prevent your plans from succeeding. Their job, their goal is to stop you from winning. Your goal is to win. So it's not that different from life. In life, you have goals and plans to, let's say, become rich or become famous or something, or just do something you like. Start a business or start a family or something. There's always going to be ops, as they say, right? The video game term, ops. There's always going to be some oppositions, right? There's going to be some obstacles. There's going to be stuff in your way that's going to try to prevent you from achieving your goals, which is why you got to be good to be able to avoid those things, right? To be able to move forward regardless of those restrictions, limitations, right? Those issues. Because I know it's a lot of players like to focus very heavily on the idea of like when they play against certain decks, they need specific cards for those specific matchups. Instead of having cards that generically are good, that works no matter what deck they're playing against or what situation they're in, they want specific cards for specific matchup. Like literally, some people play cards for the sole purpose of creating a scenario where their opponent gets punished just as much as they do, right? The example for that would be Koetsukai, if I'm right, that little 1-drop black card. They want to use that against like Topo or something. So that way, whenever you attack, right, you have to get rid of 2 cards, right? But in return, your opponent has to lose cards in the process. So you want a double-edged sword scenario, right? You want a lose-lose scenario where both players are being punished for actions. And it's like, okay, 2 wrongs don't make a right, as they say. But hey, in card games, if you can do it, you will, right? But for me, I'd rather not waste time doing that. I'd rather not waste deck space playing something just to create a scenario where my opponent, gets hurt as much as I do, gets punished as much as I do in a situation. one, I'd rather not get punished, right? I'd rather not put myself in a situation where I'm losing cards just to what? Make my opponent lose cards? It's not that deep. It's not necessary. I'd rather put my opponent in a position where they're losing cards just because they're playing the cards, because they're comboing, because they're putting them onto the field, and then I just deal with them. So I have a habit, like in most card games, is that I try not to stop my opponent from playing the game. I let them play the game and then I beat them, right? I focus on beating the game, the player, right? My opponent. Because my opponent is not the cards they're playing. My opponent is my opponent, right? It's their life. And the idea is for me to make sure I can deal the damage that I want to deal, despite the fact that I have an opponent that's in my way, right? It's not that different from like playing soccer. You're trying to kick the ball into the goal, but there's a goalie and they're going to be there to try to stop you. The idea is to try to make it where they can't stop you or won't stop you or don't stop you. And that's all you're trying to do, is make sure your opponent can't stop you from doing the things you want to do. But too many players are so focused on trying to stop their opponent from doing anything. You know, sometimes you gotta change your game plan. You gotta do things differently to deal with what your opponent is doing, because maybe your opponent is doing something that's like, yeah, that's gonna be a problem. If that Unison stays on the field long enough, I will lose my whole hand. You know, that Unison is ripping cards out of my hand. That's gonna be a problem. You could try to mitigate it by trying to draw more cards, right? You know, utilize your draw effects to try to mitigate the hand control element of that situation, or try to get rid of the Unison, which is going to be wasting a lot of attacks. But if you play your cards right, as I always say, right, then you should be able to get rid of the Unison and, you know, stop the bleeding, as they say, right? Prevent your hand, from slowly getting reduced. But always expect the opponent might play another copy of the Unison and you'll be back to square one, right? So that can happen. Which is why a lot of times I try not to waste valuable attacks on Unisons, because they could always play another copy and then I'm just back to square one, and I wasted a lot of resources trying to deal with one copy. Now I gotta deal with another copy, and if I don't have any resources to deal with it, then I'm in a bad situation. I'd rather try to gain more resources to help combat my opponent's strategy. But you know, in general, this is not about game theory. This is about like decks that leaders that have potential for gameplay, right? Because a lot of people like to go to tried and true, leaders and stuff, and like, hey, I'm not against it. If the leader works for you and you can build different types of deck with that leader, fine. Bowman's a good leader to build a lot of decks with. Hatchiac is a good leader to build, a lot of different, builds with. Soul Striker, right? The list goes on. But there's some leaders, even some old leaders, they're still worth playing if you just, consider playing them. You give them a shot. So Janemba being one of them, that's still viable. There's people who like to play cooler, and I get it because it has the potential to mill more instead of just, typically just milling 2 cards a turn. You do have the potential to mill more with cooler. And, I am a fan of cooler, so I do play cooler mill myself. But Janemba has potential, right? Because, the whole idea is you just, obviously some people call it a helmet deck and stuff like that. The idea is like you're just camping essentially. It's like, yeah, well, sometimes camping is a strategy. It's a game plan, right? Sit back on your defenses, your counter plays, right? On your Unison, sit back on that stuff, and then just swing with the leader and mill your opponent out. And the whole goal is to always get extra turns, so that way when you attack with the leader, you mill your opponent out, and hopefully you have other cards to help you mill your opponent out. Like I'm trying to incorporate the 4-drop send Shinron negative energy explosion because of his, spirit boost ability to mill your opponent for 1 card. Having that combined with Janemba and a couple other cards, like a couple of Janemba cards that also mill, and combine those and try to get a lot of mill out of it, but still be able to keep your defenses up so that way you can stay in the game longer, because it's more of a grind game, right? A waiting game. The whole idea is to get as many turns as possible so you can get as many mills as possible, and then that's supposed to add up to milling your opponent out. Obviously, you should always think of, when you build, the Janemba deck, for example, or any mill deck, always think of milling your opponent out for 60 cards. Even though your opponent's not going to have 60 cards in their deck when the game starts because of the whole 8 life and 6 card hand thing. So that's 14 cards out their deck. So they're going to have less than 60 cards in their deck. You should still, make sure that your deck strategy has the potential to mill 60 cards. For whatever reason, in case there's some reason they have the ability to put cards back in their deck. So mathematically, it will be a lot like they had a 60 card deck, which is why I'm, putting that information out there. It's important to keep that in mind. Because that's what I do. I take into account that my opponent might have cards that lets them put cards in their drop back into their deck. So then, as a mill player, right, that would be a problem. It's like, oh, damn, they put cards back in the deck. That actually adds extra cards that I have to mill to, my strategy. So if my deck is not designed to do, up to 60, right, or 60, mill 60, that those extra cards they put back in the deck can be the difference between winning and losing, And the idea is not to lose because you couldn't, accomplish a win con, which is to mill your opponent out when it comes to milling. Same thing comes to like anything else, like burn strategies, dealing your opponent double strike, and somehow they have a card effect that turns your double strike into single strike, and it's like, oh shit, didn't see that coming. So always gotta be prepared for stuff like that. But besides Janemba, having playability, what's his name? The Vegeta, it's a promo Vegeta. It's the one that counts as all the colors except black. And he has critical on the front. And when your opponent's leader is awakened, he gets 5k extra power. So he'll be 15k crit on the front side. So that's something you'll want to keep on purpose. Like, you want to have him on the front side on purpose because of that. And then, save your awakening for the right moment in time, when the time is right. So there's a Goku. What was I saying? Oh yeah, the Vegeta leader, definitely a good leader to use, because it does let you use a lot of cards in the game that otherwise you wouldn't be able to use unless you had a specific leader. So being able to have a leader that counts as multiple colors is definitely a good leader to play with, especially a leader with crit, because that by default will reduce your opponent's ability to gain hand advantage, especially if you give it double strike and then you're double strike critting your opponent, especially the first 2 turns of the game. You can, reduce your opponent's hand size. So that type of potential, and the fact that you don't have to awaken your leader, because as soon as your opponent awakens, you're technically awakened because you'll be equal in power. And then all you have to do is just focus on, drawing cards and, keeping your hand size nice and thick and taking your opponent, life down to 0, right? So I'm definitely experimenting with that leader again. Because like I said, it lets you use certain cards that otherwise you wouldn't be able to use. Like, for example, Dimension Magic. The fact that you can use Dimension Magic even without having the energy for it, because you could just use the sparking negate aspect of the card and as a tech card, right? So you play Dimension Magic, untap 2 energy, and then use those energies for whatever you want. Which is obviously good idea. So these are the kind of stuff you want to take into consideration. Or let's say there's another spark and negate that has a useful effect that you might want to have. So by having this leader, you'll be able to play it, tech it in. So being able to tech in certain spark and negates is very useful. Or just any card that says, if your leader is green, you get to do this. If your leader is red, you get to do that. So just pointing that out is like, always keep that in mind. The multicolored leaders, I like to call them. Vegeta being, one of them that's really good. There's other ones you can look into. There's a Goku, like a Kid Goku one, but I definitely like the Vegeta one, mainly because of its crit. And I'm just used to it, used to playing it. Let's see. Then we have the Goku. A lot of people like to call it Dredgeku. It's the one that has the, obviously the burst ability. I think burst 3 if I'm right. And then on the Awakened side, it has the board wiping, ignorant barrier ability, which very useful, especially if you're trying to play certain strategies certain cards that says when your opponent doesn't have battle cards, you can play the cards and get certain effects. So there's some cards like that. So that'd be a good leader to use because you can guarantee the board will be clear for those types of cards to be played, because they say as long as your opponent doesn't have a battle card, you get to play this card or you get these effects. So that would be useful in that regards. Another thing is, if you're trying to play a certain card that requires you not to have battle cards, this card will be useful because this card will also clear your own board as well, not just your opponent. But if you could take advantage of clearing your own board, that's not a problem, right? You swing with all your battle cards, then use your leader's ability to clear the board, and then play the whatever card you want to play, like a catastrophic blow, for example, so you can finish off the game. Burn is my go-to, obviously, win con strategy, just because it's hard to interact with. The other, uninteractable, card to use as a win con are Unisons. I'm leaning a lot into using Unisons, especially a lot of Unisons do have what we call ultimate, like their ultimate minus ability or plus, minus ability typically, where you minus a whole bunch of markers and you get a really powerful effect like triple attack plus extra 15k power or something like that. So you have a 30k triple attack or something, and that definitely can win you out a lot of games. So it's just a matter of setting your opponent up for that. So I call it Unison Finishers. Because a lot of times when you think of a finisher, you think of a battle card, and then you don't want your opponent to God Sealing Trunks it, right, as an example, or even counterplay it or something. So you try to get a battle card that has Deflect and Barrier, so it technically makes it like a Unison. But why do that when you can just use a Unison, right? Just use a Unison that can do that. And the thing about Unisons, if you look at it as you look at Unison Finishers or finishers that you're going to use as Unisons, look at their cost, like for them to go ultimate versus actual battle cards that you could use as finishers, you will realize that the cost tends to be a lot less than a battle card. Like, a lot of battle cards tend to be really pricey when it comes to putting them on board to try to use them as a finisher. And sometimes their attack power can be a little subpar sometimes. Sometimes you might have a 7-drop 25k finisher. 25k is not a bad attack power, but it's not the greatest. 30k and above will be better. So the potential of having a 30k finisher or a 40k finisher is way better. Those numbers are way better when you're going for game. You want your base power to be 30k and above. When you're trying to go for game, because as I said many times before in other videos, on your opponent's Awakened side, in order for them to out-combo, so because when their leader's at 15k and you swing with a 30k, they need 20 combo power in order to out combo your attack, which means either 2 super combos or 4 0 cost 5k combo power. So either 2 or 4 cards will be used from their hand in order to try to out combo your attack, and that's if they're out comboing. That doesn't include blocking or negating the attack, obviously. But just to try to out combo your attack, that's the situation. So you want your opponent to be in that situation where they need 2 to 4 cards from their hand to try to stop your attack. But of course, the idea is you're going to combo beyond 30k, or increase the power beyond 30k with card effects or comboing, so that way you can greatly increase the chances of them not being able to out combo it. Or if they do manage to out combo it, they used up way more cards from their hands, so they could end up with no hand just because they were trying not to lose, especially if it's the game-winning attack, right? Which means they will either A, have to out combo, or B, lose just by taking the damage. So you always want to put your opponent in kill range, as they say. You always want to put them in a situation where if they don't stop your attack, you'll win. So, which is why it's always important to get them down to 2 life and make sure everything you swing with has double strike, or at least can attack more than once, like dual attack or triple attack. So what was I saying? So that's just about power and stuff like that. But certain leaders that you want to take into consideration would be leaders that give you extra life, as it were. Leaders that makes it easier for you to stay in the game a little bit longer, so that way you can get that extra turn necessary to win. Like the yellow Jiren leader that has the ability where you take a life in order to make it where your leader don't take damage, for example. Or set 2 Zamasu that I like to use, where essentially I have 2 health bars. Once I get to 2 life, I can awaken, and now every time my opponent deals me damage, I have to mill the top 5 cards of my deck for every damage. So essentially my deck becomes my second life health bar, right? Second life, which makes it where I can play the long game, right? I could play games out to turn 6, 7, 8, 9, with that type of leader. So if that's the goal and I want them extra turns, especially if I'm playing best of 1, that's a real good leader to play. And the cool thing is you can use any strategy. Like, you don't have to play blue just because the leader's blue. You could play green and do some hand control. You could play red and be aggro and just kind of, if your opponent tries to go aggro, since you have 2 life bars, even if they go aggro and they get close to, dealing you 8 damage in 1 turn in the first couple turns of the game, since you have, a second health bar, they have to work twice as hard. Their goal was to just deal 8 damage. You technically have up to 16 life, so that will give you the advantage against a aggro deck while you're playing aggro, or some type of blue control, or some blue-green hand control, or whatever. That's the thing that's great about the leader, is that you could just play whatever you want, because the leader, is doing his job, which the leader is protecting himself, right? Making it where you don't have to worry about defending your leader as much as you normally would with many other leaders. You could just focus on being aggressive, being aggro, just taking your time, building up your board, building up your win con, while your opponent is dealing with the fact that you have twice the amount of life that they have. Especially if you're going up against like King Piccolo, which already starts off with 6 life. If they play their deck right, they'll technically be 7, because they'll be able to gain 1 life back just in case. With the rejuvenate effect of their King Piccolo Unison. But other than that, it's like you already have the advantage of having way more life to them. So your chances of surviving and staying in the game longer is a lot higher. And then on top of that, you're playing defensive cards, especially if you're playing blue or yellow. You're playing a lot of defensive cards that it'll be hard for them to, get past your defense to even deal you damage in the first place. And then when they do deal you damage, you have so much life, you know, because of the whole health bars scenario, right? It'll make it too hard for them to finish you out in a fast time frame. You know, Hatchiac is another leader that obviously I play with, Bulma, you know, because they're very defensive, so they help you stay in the game longer. So staying in the game longer, you know, increases your chances of winning, because you always got them extra turns you can try to use to win out the game. But even though you get those extra turns, and these decks are good at giving you extra turns and helping you get into the late game, you still should be trying to win the game as early as possible. What other leaders I see potential in just to be used inherently, because it's always weird, annoying to see people, talk about certain colors not being good. Like, oh, green is not a good color. Oh, red is not a good color. It's like, that's wrong. They're all good. It just, right now, the color is not favorable among the player base, among the community, but doesn't mean the color is bad or anything. It's just not popular. But all the colors are good, and they're good at what they do. It just depends on what you want to do. If you're more into aggro play style, then of course every other color is bad compared to red, obviously, right? If you're into hand control, every other deck is not as good as green, right? In that regard. So it depends on what you're doing that determines what color is the best for you at the time. So yellow could be the best right now, for example. I mean, it's red, but it's always red. That's the funny thing. In the beginning of a very format, red is always the most dominant color. It's everybody's go-to color because, aggro. You always want to start off every new format just going in hard, trying to win games as quickly as possible, trying to, test out the meta, as it were. And then, because red is basically the benchmark. It determines, the pace of the game. And if you want to play a slower game, then that's where you start going into the other colors. Red is, the fastest color, right? It's the faster color, I should say. So typically you use it as a way of gauging the meta with that, and then everything else is compared to them. But that's why it's always weird when somebody tries to say that, oh, red hasn't been good in a long, long time. It's like, false. It has always been good. It's still good. I just did. After a while, it went out of favor because some players, just got tired of playing red or playing against red. So they started playing something different. So then, at some point, people are going to get used to aggro, going to increase the defensive capabilities of their decks, whatever color they choose, like yellow, green, blue, whatever, right? And then red, falls out of favor because these decks are more prepared for red. But as soon as these colors start getting, relax and start trying to be a little bit more aggro, that's when red comes right back in, reminding them the other colors, right, that red is the aggro color, and then everybody has to go back to defense. And that's just the nature of the community, the state of the game, that I always find funny to see. And it's weird that most people, especially people who make content, content creators, for example, a lot of stuff, whenever they talk about colors, it always sounds political. Like they're only saying a color is good just because they see that it's popular, so they're trying to be a bandwagoner and be like, yeah, yellow is the best color right now because of this, that, and the third, and try to act like they always supported that color, like they always knew the color was good. But it's like, wait, wasn't last week you saying that it wasn't really a good color? Green was a good color instead, or some shit like that, because they got some new support. And then next week suddenly it's like, oh, yellow's the best. It's like, wait, weren't you saying green was the best last time? So a lot of two-facedness, in the community when it comes to stuff like that. Just something I noticed that's always annoying to see. People going back and forth. Like, color is irrelevant. It's the player that determines if something's good or not, right? You know what I mean? And I've proven that time and time again that it's not the deck, it's the player. The deck, has some importance, some value, some use. Obviously, you need the deck in order to play the game, but ultimately, it's the player, you and your opponent, that ultimately determines the outcome of a match. It is not y'all decks, it's not y'all matchup, none of that nonsense. It's not the meta. It's not how much somebody spent on their decks, whether they have TPs or not, they have an ultimate or not. None of that. Or if they play tested enough or not. Ironically, you don't even have to play test that much. Once you understand the fundamental basic rules of the game, and you can play the game at the most basic level, where you understand, how easy it is to do the first four damage, right? And then the next two doesn't require that much effort, just a little bit. And the last two is the hardest. And that's where the real game, the real skills come in, is dealing the last two damage when your opponent has a whole bunch of negates in their hands, right? Because here's something that's ironic. What I do when I mulligan, I always mulligan my negates away, because I'm not going to need the negates until, turn 3, turn 4, and beyond. So I always mulligan my negates away, and then, just so I can have all my aggro stuff, right? All my attack-based cards, the stuff I'm going to use to attack my opponent with. And then the first 2 turns of the game, I'm just focusing on dealing damage, which is why I tend to deal 6 to 7 damage relatively easy in the first 3 to 4 turns, because I'm focusing on just dealing damage early game, which is the best time to deal damage, because that's the most common time where defense is very low. But after turn 3, after you and your opponent have 3 energy and more, that's when it's going to get tough, because they can afford multiple negates, right? And remember, negates typically cost 1 to 2 energy, or for free, right? So so your opponent can potentially stop multiple attacks. Floodgate negates are a factor. So after turn 2, your opponent can start dropping Topos and Oceanus and so forth, right? Violent Rays and all that good stuff. So you gotta keep an eye on that. Of course, turn 3 and above, when you have 3 or more energy, that's where some of the ultimates are useful, right? Like with Baby Hatchiac, obviously, and Pan Time Maiden. Most of those cards require you to have 3 or more energy. Think about it. Why did Bandai specifically choose 3 or more energy as the criteria for a lot of these cards? It has to be for the same reason that I keep talking about. The first 2 turns is the best time to deal damage, and then turn 3 and above, it's harder to deal damage. It's because that's just how the game works out. They didn't choose 3 randomly. They chose it deliberately. They saw it, they knew it. And I saw it, and I figured it out, right? I figured out that, first 2 turns, most people don't defend as much. But once, turn 3 hits, then players tend to be more defensive. They tend to, try to keep an energy up or two to make plays, like Topo, Violent Rays and stuff like that, right? So that's why they make it like that. It's just something that I noticed for a long, long time. And, I've been sharing that information in my master class and other videos, of like, well, that's something I see. That's a pattern, And a lot of times Bandai, even recently, been proving me right on a lot of my concepts, which is ironic, where a lot of players who are aware of my videos, aware of me, seem not to like my, ideas or what I'm doing, like sharing and stuff, even though it's like I'm sharing for free. Why people are mad about free information? Like, that's ridiculous, but whatever. Sharing, my ideas and stuff, but then they don't realize I'm ahead of the game, right? I'm doing things before Bandai even does. Before even Bandai is like, yeah, this is true. You don't need this. You don't need that. You can play this way. You can do that. Recently we got a new leader that is Unison eccentric, right? It specifically likes to focus on Unison. It likes the idea of you playing a lot of Unisons in the deck. which is what I've been doing since Unisons came out, was playing a lot of Unisons in a deck. I've tried different ratios. I tried just 4 Unisons, 8 Unisons, I tried breaking it down to like 6 Unisons. Like, I tried different ratios, obviously 16, 20, 24 at one point. I did the full 60. I did a 60 card Unison deck. So ironically, right now I have 25 Unisons in that Goku deck, but I haven't tested out. I just start putting the deck together. But I am thinking of trying to reduce the number of Unisons, unless 20, 25 works, because I have I have an ultimate that's a Unison, so that's why it's 25, not 24. So I have 25 Unisons in the deck, and I might whittle it down to like maybe 17 Unisons. So that would be 8. So I will be taking out 8 Unisons possibly, and then I'll have 17 Unisons in a 53 card deck. Anyway, we'll see what happens. Or I'll just keep the 25 Unisons in that 53 card deck. What matters is that it works, right? Whatever works. So if it works, it works. But that's the thing, is like, I try things and it works, and then I share the information. But then you got people who just quick to be like, nah, that doesn't work. I don't believe it. That's a bad idea, blah, 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 blah. And the funny thing is, they're just making those assumptions and those judgments based on their own personal experience, instead of like, oh, this is interesting. See, there used to be in other card games, especially in Yu-Gi-Oh, a long time ago, I used to get thousands of views on my videos because people actually were curious. They actually had the mindset of they don't know nothing right off the bat. Like, they'll look at a video, like a deck profile, for the purpose of learning, of finding out something new. They didn't watch it and be like, oh, I know everything, so I already know that this deck is terrible, blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, you don't. You don't know shit. This is your first time seeing this deck in this exact build, this exact ratio, so you don't know if it works or not until you try it. See, that's the difference between back in the day, before, let me see, when did people stop? I think 2012, 2013, something like that. I think it's when I started getting less views on my videos. And it's not because my videos ain't good, my quote unquote content ain't good. I'm not a content creator, but the point is it's not that my videos ain't good. It's not the information I'm sharing ain't good. Is that players, most newer players, are less curious, less open-minded to the idea that they don't know what they think they know, right? They don't know everything. So they act like they know everything. Therefore, when they see something and they disagree with it, just by looking at it, bang, they immediately want to be negative. And it's like, but that don't make no sense. You don't know what you're talking about because you don't have no experience in this thing to even talk. So get the experience first. Try out the decks. There's tons of people who actually gave my decks a shot and realized that I know what I'm talking about. I know what I'm doing. There's some people who, joke that I'm a great deck builder, right? When they think the opposite. All right, to each their own. I don't care. That's their opinion. That's not a fact. But then there's some people who actually know, who know the truth, right? Because they actually took the time and effort to understand why I built my decks the way I built them. What's the purpose? Why they function the way they function. And that's, what they say, knowledge is power. So they took the time to gain the knowledge, to get the understanding. There's some people who actually understand that, my understanding of the game is different because I actually spend time trying to understand the game, the mechanics, even the reason why Bandai creates things the way they created. Think about it. Bandai created an archetype called Frieza Prison, right? Created an archetype, created a leader that specifically prohibited the use of super combos by having a restriction where you couldn't play super combos because super combos typically had the energy cost of 2. They recently made a super combo that cost 3, so you could have a super combo in that deck. But think about the fact that they, right off the bat, didn't give you that card. They should have gave you that 3-drop super combo for that deck specifically at that point in time. if they truly believe that every deck has to have super combos. Why didn't they? Why were they okay with making a leader that prevents you from playing super combos? It's not like that was a mistake. It's not like they forgot that, the leader prevents you from playing super combos. No, they did that on purpose. Which, to me, it just shows proof that, yeah, you don't need super combos to play the game. It's not mandatory to play them. But they eventually did give you the ability to play super combos. And I support it. I'm not against it. I'm like, yeah, finally they gave y'all a three drop super combo for the deck, for those who want super combos in the deck. But, very few times I see people comment and they'll point out like, oh, damn, they use my name. Like, hey, Heriberto, he was ahead of the game. Because ironically, there was somebody who actually went to a tournament and played without super combos. So that was a thing. And somebody pointed that out in a one of those team talk podcasts, pointing out that, that I was already ahead of the game with the whole not playing super combo thing. Which is not really special or unique. It's just that, ironically, people made such a big deal about me not using super combos for a long time that, it became a thing. But it's like, it's not really a thing. It's not that big of a deal. It's a super combo. You can or cannot play. It's up to you. Play whatever you want. You don't have to play super combos. But anyway, for a lot of people, they disagree. A lot of people, believe that you do have to. Okay, to each their own. But that right there lets me know part of the mentality and the state of the community where, people are so specific about how things are supposed to be. So once somebody does something different, suddenly that person is wrong. Suddenly it's perceived as they don't know what they're doing. They're bad. They're terrible. They don't know how to play this game. Blah 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 blah. And the list goes on and on and on. And it's sad because that obviously is part of internet culture. Current internet culture, part of the new generation, where the new generation is, is always trying to find ways to point down at somebody like, oh, you're wrong, you did something wrong, and because you're not doing things quote unquote the right way, therefore you're beneath me. I'm better than you because I do things the quote unquote right way. And the thing is, there's more than one way to skin a cat, as they say. There's more than one way to do something. So there is no one way. There is a way. But there is no the way, right? There's no one way of doing things. There's multiple ways of doing things. Just like there's multiple Soul Striker builds, multiple Hatchiac builds, multiple Bomba builds, and the list goes on and on. One of the things that I noticed, other than, people being, stuck on the idea of, you have to play a deck a certain way, is also the idea that you're supposed to net deck. A lot of people like to think that net decking is normal, like you're supposed to do that when you play card games, when that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to, build decks yourself and figure things out yourself, but whatever. And then there's the idea of you gotta play archetypes. Just because the game has archetypes doesn't mean you have to play them. You can build whatever you want, right? Grab a lot of generic good stuff, right? And build whatever you want. Make your own deck. You don't gotta play a specific build like everyone else does. Because one that gives you the same weaknesses as everyone else does. Well, I just realized I'm getting way too much into game theory and rants. The whole idea is like there are some leaders out there that are worth giving a try, and you should give it a try. I hate that some leaders don't get the proper respect they deserve and the proper usage just because some people rather just play something that they're used to. A lot of people are against change, so they automatically assume that if something's different, that means it's bad, it's wrong. No, it's different. You might want to consider that there's a possibility that it's better than what you think it is. Be open-minded. And that's the thing. More and more players, I notice, are becoming more and more closed-minded. More and more closed-minded. Like, a lot of times some of my decks get compared to other decks, They be like, oh my god, this deck is not like this other deck. You should have this, that, and third. And the deck is like, yeah, but I don't like those cards. Those cards I don't use. I don't use them. I don't play that way. I don't play in a way where I need those types of cards. They be like, oh, you need counterplay this and counterplay that. It's like, but I don't play counterplays. That's not how I play the game. So it makes no sense for me to use cards I don't actually play. That's not my play style, so it makes no sense for me to play stuff that I don't play. You might play that way. You might play the whole don't let your opponent play the game, and that's how you win strategy. Good for you. You have a strategy that works for you. You prevent your opponent from playing the game. That's essentially spawn camping. Preventing your opponent from being able to play the game because you keep killing them every time they respawn. All right, you do you. You play that play style of spawn camping, constantly counter playing your opponent. But that's not how I play. I let my opponent spawn and run around and we go back and forth and have a battle. That's what I prefer. So I'll play how I play, you play how you play. And the things I don't tell people to play differently, right? I just point out that, there's a way that I play and it works for me. And if it works for you, hey, great. If it doesn't, then, do you. Play how you play. But what's ironic is a lot of people don't share the way they play. Like they don't put out effort to be like, okay, this is how I play the game. This is how I see the game. And this is what I do when I play the game. It's always like, this is the meta deck. This is what everybody else is doing. Blah, blah, blah. It's a whole bunch of sheeps and not enough, shepherds, as they say, not enough leaders. You got a lot of followers, but not enough leaders. And that's always, weird for me because it's like, yeah, I'm not a following trend type person. I don't do what everybody else does. I'm not a follower. I'm definitely a leader. And I do my best to lead by example, not lead by just telling people like, hey, you should play this way. No super combos because I say so. No, do what works, right? I always say, whatever works. So, I'm gonna keep saying that for a long time. Whatever works. So whatever works for you, just like whatever works for me, works for me. And I always assume that whatever I do, whatever build I build, that it works for me. Never assume that it doesn't work for me. Never assume that it doesn't work for me. And that'll be the end of the podcast.